Welcome everyone to today's podcast from TTM Coaching. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alan Kennedy and I help accountants and solicitors grow their practice. Quite apart from that, I have been married for 45 years and I'm very grateful I have. We have 4 lovely kids, 6 grandchildren, and we're about to all go on holiday together. It's my idea of heaven. But I recognize for some people it's not like that. And one of the big frustrations I've had during my time in business is seeing the difficulty that divorce causes. So I'm talking today to Claire Colbert about divorce and all the issues. She's a very experienced divorce lawyer, and I've dealt with her on cases before. She's been absolutely brilliant. So Claire, tell me a bit about yourself.
Thank you, Alan. So I have historically been a family lawyer, helping couples who are separating and dealing with the financial and child arrangements that follow out of their decision to separate. But in September of last year, left the legal profession, stood down from the solicitor's role to be a non-practicing solicitor, to concentrate solely on mediation, which has been a part of my professional practice for a number of years, but is now all I do. And so now I mediate for couples and I help them come up with all of the solutions to the points I was just mentioning, so any of those issues.
Right, brilliant. Okay, so you are really a proper lawyer, but you just pretend not to be. Okay.
So I have been a proper lawyer for a long time.
Okay.
The bit that's a bit different now is I'm not allowed to give advice. So I can give information, I can give options, I can talk about the way the law works, but what I can't do is you should do this, you must do this, or this would be best for you. I have to stop myself from saying that now.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so let's imagine that I'm in a marriage where the trust has gone. That could be for any number of reasons. It could be there's another person involved. It could be that the behavior is unacceptable, but the trust has gone and it's irreparable. How would mediation help me?
So mediation is there to avoid court as a primary purpose. So instead of going off and spending money and stress and hassle of going through the court process to resolve any of the legal and practical consequences stemming from that decision to separate, mediation helps you step in and sort that out together much quicker, cheaper, easier, stress-free, with the hope, particularly when we have children, of continuing a co-parenting relationship, because ending the marriage doesn't end that will carry on. And in the same way, trying to sort out our finances and divide our finances, we don't want to spend them all on lawyers trying to sort them out. It's just not cost proportionate. So mediation is about getting somebody to step in, preferably somebody who knows the law and can tell you what the options are and talk you through those, but to step in and facilitate the conversations, make sure everybody has the information they need to make informed decisions about where they're going to live, what they're going to do with their assets, what they're going to do with their children, how their children are going to spend their time, how they're going to afford to pay for 2 houses when they've only been paying for 1, which can be quite a tricky calculation to come up with.
Okay, lovely. Right, I'm going to go off piece here. Before Claire and I started this podcast, we arranged the script and all that sort of thing. Claire, are you married?
I am.
Yes.
15 years.
With children?
With 2 children, 2 teenagers, so I'm properly in the midst of the hard bit.
Right. Okay. So what does your husband think of you talking to divorced couples all the time? Divorcing?
So I was a divorce lawyer when we met, actually. So in his wedding speech, he commented about how many divorce lawyers were in the room and how nervous he was. So he started off knowing early on what he was setting himself up for. But actually, he kind of, from his side of the fence, sees that I see a lot of how marriages can go wrong. And so sometimes when I say, I'm not sure we should do things like that, or I'm not sure that was how we should have said that, or perhaps we should think differently about it, he can see that it's coming from an informed place.
Yes.
So it does mean that I probably bring to the marriage some tips and ideas of how to avoid the pitfalls.
Okay, lovely. So for example, occasionally my wife points out my minor imperfections. If I then use that as an excuse to point out her minor imperfections, it doesn't always work so well. So presumably you've learned that from...
Yeah, and it's, I mean, quite often I work with a lot of family therapists who help families try and move things forward, and they'll be part of the mediation process. But those family therapists would talk about, actually, do we need to point out the imperfection, or do we need to point out what the frustration is? And the imperfection we might not be able to change, but the consequence of that, so for example, tidiness is quite quite often one that comes
Yes.
up. One
Yeah.
person's very tidy, one isn't. And actually, it isn't that someone isn't perfect because they're not as tidy as the other, but it's the consequence on the person that's very tidy and how that frustrates them. So instead of saying, you're not very good at this, and being quite accusatory and making the other person defensive, it's saying, okay, look, I really struggle when it's like this, because then that isn't putting somebody in a position where they're having to defend themselves. It's saying, look, I've got this and it's really upsetting me. What can we do about it?
That's very good. You are talking to the world's most untidy person.
I didn't know that, Alan.
Right. Okay. Lovely. Right. We better go back on script, haven't we? Otherwise, you'll
Absolutely.
tell me. Okay. Tell me a bit about the mediation process. So the relationship's broken down. I feel stressed. My wife is just stressed out her eyeballs. How does mediation help?
So mediation is about helping once we've decided the marriage is over. So sometimes, including my very own father, people get really confused that mediation is some kind of counselling, and it isn't. So I'm not looking to try and bring people back together or try and make the marriage work or anything of the sort. Sometimes it does, but that's not because of anything I've done. And so mediation is instead about saying, okay, we've decided this marriage isn't one we want to be part of anymore. How do we get out of it as quickly and painlessly as possible? Now, what I'll do is I'll meet with both the husband and the wife, or the wife and wife, or husband and husband, or whatever the dynamic is, and meet with them individually, just to have a bit of time with each of them, called an information assessment meeting, to check it's a safe place, it's a good idea, check what they're worried about, check what they want to achieve. And that's a private meeting to them. Once I've had those 2 private meetings, everything after that is done 3-way. So at the moment, everything on screen, occasionally face to face, but people like the on screen because it feels quite safe. So we will have those meetings where we will sort out all the finances. We'll make sure all the financial information and disclosure is exchanged. We will then talk about, okay, what are we going to do about houses? What are we going to do about bank accounts? What are we going to do about debts? What happens about our businesses? What happens about our pensions? What do we do about the children? Where are they going to live? And how are we going to pay for life? What are we going to do about any maintenance? And we do it in quite a strategic way of talking about the things that we need to sort out first, moving to the things that we need to sort out last. And sometimes that means we talk about children first, sometimes we talk about money first. And we follow the same path as the law. So looking at the issues in the way that the Matrimonial Causes Act does, or the Children Act would. And we can talk about any of the financial issues that need to make sure everything is covered, with the hope that at the end of the process, I can draw that up into a without prejudice document called a Memorandum of Understanding, and a lawyer can turn that into a court order. Now, what that does is short circuit the court process. So instead of 12 to 18 months in the court system and several £1,000s of course, I'm not going to quote how much, but many £1,000s of course, you're looking at that being done potentially over 3 to 5 meetings. That could be 3 to 5 weeks. For some people it's a bit longer, for some people it's a bit shorter. It really is up to the couple and how much information they already have.
Right. Okay. Lovely. I just about understand that, although we got a bit technical when we mentioned the Matrimonial Causes Act.
So I'm just what I mean by that is I explain the law. So I'll talk about what the law says and what the options are. People don't need to know that coming in. In fact, very few people do, because quite a lot of the time they haven't gone through this process or a divorce before. And that's my job, to talk them through that. Okay. So I just mentioned the law because this isn't, as some people think, a very fluffy, nice, way to have a chat. No. Actually, we're using the procedures that are already there and the legislation that exists to help them come up with the solutions they need to.
And am I right in thinking that divorce law, a bit like employment law, is all about fairness? Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's fairness is its kind of underlying criteria. So we start off by saying, okay, if we divide the assets in this way, does it create a solution that meets everybody's needs? So can everybody do what they need to? Can it mean people can buy houses, and can people afford to retire, and will people have enough income? But secondly, does it create a solution that's fair? And the difficulty with matrimonial law and a lot of the legal system is that's interpreted by a judge at the end of the day. And what one judge thinks might be fair might be very different to another judge. So there is a little bit of roulette we play here if we go off to court of, well, which judge might I get and what might they think? Whereas in the mediation process, what do we think is fair as a couple? What do we think is right? We're not going to give the power to somebody else to decide what they think is fair and what is right. We're going to come up with that and then just ask them to approve it.
Yes. Okay. Lovely. Yes. I like your comment about judges, because when I've talked to clients about litigation in the past, I describe it as like a poker game, whereby both of you put £50,000 down on the table. and you keep your fingers crossed that the judge hasn't had a row with his wife or husband, his or her wife or husband on the day. Okay, is that a fair description of litigation?
I have to be very careful because my business partner is a judge.
Yeah.
So Rachel Oakes, who I work with, is a deputy district judge. But it is a little bit about the judge's own perception. And also it's a little bit about how we feel on the day of a final hearing, because that poker game, when we arrive at it, we might not have had a good night's sleep. We might not have had a good day. And we're giving evidence on that day that might not be the best it could. And so we've let ourselves down as well. So
Yeah.
it falls on the judge and the judge's discretion, but it also falls on how we might feel on the day. And actually, have we had a couple of sleepless nights? Has the business got worse or better by then? Has the house price plummeted? Have we just had an argument with one of the children on our way to court because they're cross about something? And has that meant we've gone into court and a judge has thought, oh, I don't like the way they're giving this evidence. I don't know if I believe what they've just said, which changes everything again. So it's that roulette, absolutely, poker or roulette.
Yes. Okay. Right. Why can't I do this myself?
So some people can, and lots of people do sit around the kitchen table together, sometimes a glass of wine, sometimes a cup of tea, and say, look, we've decided the marriage is broken down, let's come up with a plan. And they absolutely do come up with a plan together, and they don't need mediation. Mediation is there for the couples that struggle to communicate or don't know what the options are. So some people do lots of reading before they divorce and try and work out what the options are and then go to a lawyer and get it approved and it's done. Other people don't have that knowledge, and so they're around the kitchen table together going, well, what can we do? We don't know, and we're googling it, but actually that information is quite complicated and it takes a lot of legal training to get to the point where you can understand those options, because if we could all Google it, there'd be no more lawyers. Right. So it's the kind of information gathering and giving them the ability to come up with the conclusions together rather than forcing them to try and work it out themselves.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. I understand that. I came across an epic case where they had actually worked it out themselves. They sat down at the table and they'd done everything, even decided on the childcare arrangements, the finances, everything was sorted, except for who had the dogs.
Yeah.
And they spent 2 years arguing about these dogs and spent around about £50,000 each of legal fees.
Yeah.
What's your solution to that problem? Who should have the dogs?
Yeah, so it wouldn't ever be my solution, because as a mediator, I'm never going to say anybody has to do this or that. But what we can talk about in mediation is exactly what they want to. And I've talked about rotas for pets, for dogs, for cats. I've talked about how we might have to think, well, do the pets travel with children? And that quite often happens when we have children that are moving between houses. Do dogs and cats go with them? Because children are quite often very attached to animals. And so I'll give lots of options and ideas, and then I'll talk about the cost proportionality, because I imagine those clients at the beginning wouldn't have expected spending over £100,000 fighting about the dogs. I've had exactly the same situations in my legal career where people fought over items of contents, antiques or vases or sentimental pictures. And they fought over them because they felt so impassioned about it. It felt so morally important, also it's such an important part of what they were arguing about. But with hindsight, looking back, I wonder now if they think, was it really worth that £100,000? And actually, could there have been another solution that practically worked without spending all that money?
And so you would tell them what the law said about the dogs.
So I'll talk to them about what the law is, but what I won't say is you've got to do this or you have to do that.
So the judge might say the dogs follow the children, or the judge might say the dogs still stay in one place, or so
judges tend not to get involved in dogs, simply because they're not a matrimonial asset other than for monetary value. What they might do is make suggestions, but other than a small claims court issue for a dog, it isn't going to be something that is going to come into it unless they're particularly valuable items. You don't get an arrangements order for a dog or a cat or a guinea pig. It's more about, how does this work for you both? How does it work for the children? And if we're trying to be children focused and we're trying to make sure that we can both have good relationships with our children and be good parents in the future, is it a good idea it goes with the children, the dog? Or I say the cat, I'm not sure the cat would be quite so happy, but who knows?
Yeah. Okay, lovely. Okay. So I remember sitting down networking with a divorce lawyer. If he's listening, Martin Stacey is a brilliant divorce lawyer. And he said, my objective is to get from where you are now to a position that you can go to your daughter's wedding and still dance together. Does mediation do that?
Absolutely. That's the whole point of mediation. Well, I say it's the whole point. It's one of the main points. Cost saving, angst saving, stress saving, and trying to move this relationship from one that's potentially very tense and very upset and very difficult because we've just decided we don't want to be married to this person anymore. We might not have come to that decision together. One of us might not feel the same, to a point where we can continue to be parents, where we can be at weddings, where we can be at graduations, where we can talk civilly, where we can understand that saying negative things about the other parent is going to impact our relationship with the child just as much as the other parent's relationship with the child. I'm part of the Parenting After Parting Resolution Committee. I'm chair of that committee with Adele Ballantyne. And actually what we talk about in that committee is how can we educate parents to make sure that they realise there is a better way to do this, a better way to protect our children, to mean that when we make these decisions about our marriages, they are as protected as possible. And there's some brilliant guides and booklets that have been produced in recent years, including one by the Parenting After Parting Committee that gives lots of tips and tools. And I talk about that in mediation to try and give parents the information to mean that they're just holding their tongue at the point they want to say something that would be quite cutting or hurtful. They're pulling that back and they're stopping that. And mediation can really help that, because the other thing is when we're falling out about finances, or we're falling out about where we're going to live or what's going to happen with the business, we're tending to get quite defensive. And actually it's much better if we come up with a solution. We're not going to be defensive and we're not going to be trying to win points or score over the other one.
So do you ever have to say to people like me, Alan, which bit of shut up don't you understand?
I don't put it quite like that, but what I might say is, let's have a think about what your wife thinks. And I might just try and move it so that the other person gets a chance to speak, because it is about hearing everybody's voice and everybody hearing what the other person thinks.
Okay, that's good listening technique. I like that. I like that a lot. So, okay, let's deal with the elephant in the room, cost. I have this perception that you don't go near a lawyer unless you've got £50,000 in the bank. How much? Can you give me a range of costs for mediation?
Yeah, so mediation really varies. Some people have 2 or 3 meetings, so you're looking at maybe £1,500, something like that. Some people have 5 or 6 meetings, and that can go up to the £3,500. It's on an hourly rate, so you only get charged for the time that you spend, and it's about how long it takes to get to a solution and a plan together. So that's not in my control, that's in everybody else's. And if everyone's coming to mediation keen, the less meetings we'll need.
Yeah.
Now, if you compare that to the cost of litigation, and quite often people go, oh, £1,000 or £2,000 of mediation, my goodness, or £3,000 of mediation, my goodness. But if you can compare that to 50, 60, 70, £80,000 plus that you can spend each on legal fees, it's actually quite a short cost for a big gain.
Yeah.
There's also an added advantage at the moment that if you're talking about arrangements for children, the government have a voucher scheme that enable you to offer £500 to people wanting to come into mediation towards those joint mediation costs. So that can be a huge benefit to a couple that are perhaps thinking, I'm not sure we can afford this. Well, straight away, there's £500 to help towards those costs. It's non-means tested. The only thing you have to confirm is you haven't had one before. You're coming to mediation. You both had individual meetings, and you're talking about the arrangements for children.
Okay, fine. So talking about the arrangements for children, can it be children and dogs?
It can be children and dogs as long as they're children too.
Right. Okay, lovely. Right. Thank you so much for that. That's been informative.
Thank you, Ellen.
Okay, if you're listening to this podcast, I do hope you don't need Claire's services, because divorce is very often a very painful experience. But if you do, my experience of her, she's a brilliant mediator. So thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you, Alan.
And that's bye for now. Okay, let's stop the recording button.